Good morning. This morning we're going to be talking about the United States Constitution. And I have three goals for this lesson. The first of those is that we consider the Constitution against the backdrop of the Revolutionary War history. The second goal is that we recognize the United States Constitution as a living document that contributes to our government every day. And the third thing is to learn about the US Constitution as a foundation of our democracy. And I'd like to look at that word democracy for a minute. Probably best looked at in the words of Abraham Lincoln, who was describing our government as a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Now, I want to reflect again on the times of the Revolutionary War. The colonists were up to their ears with being under the rule of the British Empire. They were distant from the British Empire. They received very little benefit of that rule. They felt that their resources were being extracted from them, and all they got in return was a military occupation and taxation. So they created one of our founding documents called the Declaration of Independence. And this was a list of grievances that they delivered to the king that told the king all the things that the king had been doing that was oppressive. And at the end of that document, they concluded that they were going to separate from the rule of England and become a self-governing nation unto themselves. And of course, when the king received the document, the king said, "No, you're not." And we had a war. So at the time of the Revolutionary War, the colonists created the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles were a fairly simple document, but they did two important things. The first one was to create an agreement among the 13 original states to be a self-governing unit as a nation. Not 13 different countries, but 13 states comprising one single nation. And the second thing it did was to establish the United States of America as a sovereign nation. That means set apart from the British rule and to be seen throughout the rest of the world as independent, a nation to be dealt with independently. So life goes on. The colonists win the war, and we begin to become, a self-governing nation under the Articles of Confederation. And it quickly became clear that the Articles were weak. They weren't up to the need of sophistication to be governing a nation. So the founders decided to convene a constitutional convention where they would draw up a new constitution. And they came to that constitutional convention with one unifying idea, at least, which they all wanted to avoid ever being a monarchy in the future. They were done with a monarchy. And as you know, a monarchy is where the king gets to be king, and the king is the king forever. And then when the king dies, someone else gets to be king, but it's not a common person. It's someone in the king's lineage, someone's in the king's family. So the colonists wanted to avoid that. So they created a document that reflected their experience with a monarchy and wanted to replace that idea with a system where the leaders would be elected by the people, and they would be elected for a specific term of office during which they would serve, and after which they would go away or be reelected if the people decided that. And the Constitution actually has express language that says there's going to be no title of nobility in this country. So the titles that they chose for their servants in office was a title that was connected to the office, not connected to the person in office. So the US Constitution was finally ratified in 1780, and it replaced the Articles of Confederation. It identified the powers of the central government, that's the federal government. It recognized the powers of the states, and it guaranteed individual rights to citizens. Now, the Constitution is very much a product of compromise. And compromise is an agreement where we both come to a dispute and one side gives a little and another side gives a little, and we come up with a resolution to our dispute. It's like if you and I were neighbors and I have a dog that barks all the time and you get really tired of that and you call the police. Well, I don't want you to call the police and you don't want my dog to bark. So we make an agreement and I decide that I will not let my dog out after dark. And you decide that you will tolerate a little barking in the middle of the day. We have resolved our dispute through a compromise. And that's what you find throughout our Constitution. But those compromises were a product of fierce negotiation. I said that the founders came to the Constitutional Convention with this unified ideal about we're never going to have a monarchy again. Well, they also came with some special interests. So the founders had to negotiate and debate landed interests versus commercial interests. And those typically were landed interest in the South, where agriculture was the economic driver, versus the North, where they took the raw materials from the South and they made things out of them. Those were very different interests. The founders also had to debate the amount of power that would be held centrally by the federal government versus the amount of power that would be held by the individual states. They were a little reluctant to give too much central authority, and different people wanted different amounts, the federal government versus the states. And then they debated how and by whom decisions would be made, because again, this was to be a government of the people. And so who gets to be the people? Who gets to make decisions in this new government? And the Constitution did this successfully. These compromises are a magnificent creation in our Constitution. They overcame these regional differences, North versus South typically. The imbalance of population created by a commercial North, which had cities and lots of people, versus a rural South, which had fewer people. Conflicting commercial interests, raw materials versus finished products. And then there was the disagreement about slavery, and this is very important. At the time of the founding, it was legal to import people, to enslave them, to do work. That was perfectly legal. And there was a group of people among the founders that didn't want that to be a stain on our new country. They wanted that to be abolished. But there was another group of people that recognized that use of slaves to do what they did to make money was essential. And so they did not want to abolish slavery. So we find that as a huge area of disagreement among the founders who came to the Constitutional Convention. I want to mention 5 key areas of compromise that are found in the Constitution. The first of those is, I'll read it, is all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Now, again, this had to do with the imbalance, typically North versus South. The less populous South recognized that if representation was chosen on the basis of population, they would have less influence over that representation because they didn't have as many people. And so what was created in our legislature, in our legislative process, was 2 houses of government. The House of Representatives, which was chosen by population. The more populous states got more representatives, the less populous states got fewer representatives. But then they also created the Senate. And no matter how large your state was, you got 2 senators. No matter how smaller your state was, you also got 2 senators. So that was one of the compromises within the Constitution. The second area of compromise is called the 3/5 compromise. And I'll read that. The representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. Now that is really tortured language. But what it means is that when they're counting people for purposes of representation and taxation, they will count each free person as one. And then the southern states, where they didn't have as many people, they wanted to count their enslaved people. So the compromise was that the enslaved person would be counted as 3/5 of a person. And you'll notice that slavery is not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. That's just true. So the third compromise was our Commerce Clause. And remember, I said earlier, maybe I didn't, but at the time that they realized that the Articles of Confederation were too weak to be the way to outline the way the government would be conducted. They had a lot of squabbles among the states about boundaries and about how they would do trade and how they would do taxes and tariffs. And so what they decided to do was to rest the authority for regulating commerce in the federal government and among the states. That was the compromise that when they made on the basis of commerce. And another compromise, again, is the decision about slavery. And that compromise was to kick the can down the road. What the compromise was that they wouldn't make a decision about the slave trade until the year 1808. The final compromise I want to talk about is about the election of the president. And this is something, again, remember we said this Constitution is a living document. We have firsthand knowledge of how this compromise was brought to bear as in the election of the president. Of course, once again, population makes a big difference. If you're electing the president on the basis of population, then the northern states with the larger populations are going to have more votes. And the southern states are not going to have as big a say in who gets to be president. So they decided to create this electoral college. And what they did was they hold a popular election and the popular vote is taken. But after that is taken, they take that vote to the Electoral College, which is comprised of electors who are chosen by each state on the basis of the representation and the representatives plus the senators. And those electors cast votes in different ways. Different states have different rules that govern how the electors will vote. And that determines the actual outcome of the presidential election. And as recently as 2016, we know we had a popular vote won by one candidate, but that candidate didn't end up being president. We have someone who was chosen through this electoral college activity. One thing that I think is important to be mentioned in the discussion of the Constitution is that the founders had a belief in natural rights. This is found throughout the Constitution, is the concept of natural rights being the belief that people are born with inalienable rights that cannot be taken away. And that's found expressed in the preamble to our Constitution, which I will read. I can't read that too well because of the way it's lined up on my screen, but I'm going to try. Of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare and the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, which is our children, we ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, I know it's flowery language, but what it is a very high ideal that this Constitution will be a government that will serve the people. The power will rest with the people through representative government, chosen by the people through elections that will be won by majority rule, but the rights of the minority will still be protected. And you might have noticed in the discussion of the workings of Congress that there's a minority leader. And that minority leader has quite a bit of power. So the rights of the minorities are still, the minority is still protected. And by this, I mean the minority, the people who did not win the election. There's still their rights, they're still active in our government, in the workings of our government. The Constitution created 3 co-equal branches of government: the legislative branch of government, where the laws are created, the executive branch, where the laws are executed, and the judicial branch, which interprets the laws. And these branches function under a system of checks and balances. And here again, we have a lot of recent experience with these checks and balances in our living Constitution. One of these is the veto power. The legislature, the House and Senate, create laws, and those laws are passed, and it goes to the president's desk. The president wants it to be a law, the president will sign it. If the president does not want it to be a law, the president will veto it. That's a check on the power of the House and Senate, the legislative branch. That then goes back to the House and Senate to be overridden, if they can, with a higher vote margin than was required when they passed it. So that's another check on the branch of the executive. Impeachment, another check and balance that we have a very recent experience with. The Constitution says that the president and other high government officials can be removed from office if they are found to have committed treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And that is a function, again, of the legislative power of government, the branch of government being able to exercise power against the executive branch if the executive branch has abused power. And a third check and balance that should be mentioned is the lifetime appointment of justices and judges at the federal level. As we just discussed, the judicial branch interprets the laws. So let's say a law is passed in the Congress that the president signs, and that law says that people will not have a right of free speech. Well, someone sues, and that goes to the courts. And the courts are able to say, that's an unconstitutional law, and we will remove that law. We'll declare it unconstitutional, and it's not a law. That is a very real check on the power of both other branches of government. But it was found that if justices and judges were subject to a political process of removal from office, they would be less inclined to rule on the basis of the law. So they gave them lifetime appointments so that they wouldn't be subject to the political processes. And finally, there are the amendments to the Constitution. The Constitution has 2 processes actually within it that allow it to be updated. And we knew, the founders knew that the way things were in 17, whatever it was that they passed the Constitution, would not be the way things always would be. So they gave us a process of updating the Constitution, and I think it's been done about 27 times. And it's important to note that the Constitution was ratified with 10 amendments already attached to it. And this was the entitlement to individual rights, which will be discussed in another session. But that's called the Bill of Rights, and it's the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. So that actually concludes my presentation today. I wanted to conclude with a quote from Martin Luther King. I'm going to try to read this again. My screen, I'm going to minimize my screen. There we go. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. And I think in this, King is referring to the evolution of the Constitution, how it would grow and how it would serve the people through successive generations. Each generation of Americans would be an heir to this promise contained in the Constitution. And I will leave on that hopeful note. Thank you.
Can I actually just ask you to answer
Yes.
one question that I think
Yes.
people might have? And that is, we talk about the states versus the federal government. Could you just explain a little bit about the difference between what those two things are?
Again, individual states, and we know that they started with 13, but now we're up to 50, have their own government, and they have a whole system of government which begins with an executive, and it's organized very much like the federal branch, and they make laws for themselves in exactly this way. And the tension becomes whether the law in your state that governs some of our most hot button issues like abortion and what's another big one? Education, certain things that people think are rights, whether those laws are subject to override by federal law, or whether we can have a different law in Ohio than we have in our neighboring states. And there's always going to be that tension, is what laws can Ohio make without interference from the federal government, and what laws can't be interfered with. And a real good example of a law that cannot be interfered with is laws around civil rights. Those laws are contained again in the Constitution, and no state can make a law that would override the federal protections, civil rights protections that people have. Does that understand? Does that answer that?
Yeah, and I think that's a good explanation, because I think a lot of states have obviously tried to pass laws like that, and it shows the Supreme Court has ruled those to be unconstitutional. And
Right.
so,
And,
unfortunately, it took time to get that change made, but those laws have been struck down by the Supreme Court.
right.
I just wanted to have a brief little conversation about that tension, because you brought it up a couple times, and I think it's an important point that it's still, like you said, a living document that is changing and evolving. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
great.
All right. Thanks.
I'm going to stop here.